On the glittering waters of Tampa Bay, where the summer air hums with the scent of salt and gasoline, evil once took the form of an ordinary man. The sun dipped behind the Gulf of Mexico on June 1st, 1989, painting the Florida sky in streaks of gold and coral. For three tourists from Ohio, Joan Rogers and her two daughters, Michelle and Christ, it was meant to be their last peaceful night before heading home. They smiled for a camera somewhere near the marina, unaware that the man who had just offered them a boat ride beneath the stars was about to erase them from the living world. Oba Chandler looked like the kind of man who could be trusted. He wore an easy grin, spoke with a southern drawl, and carried the confidence of someone who knew the water. He seemed helpful, the sort of stranger who'd hand you a map or offer directions when you looked lost. But beneath that calm demeanor was a life scarred by deceit and violence. A petty criminal turned predator, Chandler had perfected his disguise, the friendly local who would help you find your way, only to lead you to your death. Joan Rogers, 36, was a farmer's wife from Wilshire, Ohio, practical, hardworking, the kind of woman who'd spent her life doing everything right. Her daughters were her pride, Michelle, 17, bright and shy, Christy, 14, playful and curious. Their trip to Florida was a rare adventure, a celebration of courage after years of quiet struggle. They drove hundreds of miles in their family's blue Oldsmobile, filling notebooks with memories and roadside souvenirs. When they arrived in Tampa, they were simply three tourists, eager to see the ocean, a mother and two daughters chasing a slice of summer. The city welcomed them with postcard beauty and hidden danger. That evening, the Rogers women checked into a modest motel and wandered toward the marina, camera in hand, scanning for something fun to do before heading home. Somewhere near Courtney Campbell Causeway, they met a man who seemed kind. He told them he owned a boat and could take them on a short ride after sunset, a perfect way to see the bay lights. He even wrote directions for them on a scrap of paper, neat and helpful. They thanked him and returned to their car. By dawn, they were gone. The next morning, a sailor spotted something strange floating near the Sunshine Skyway Bridge. It was a body, then another and another. Each woman had her hands tied behind her back with thick rope, her mouth sealed with duct tape. They had been forced into the water alive, their last breaths stolen by the weight of the Gulf. The horror stunned Florida. No robbery, no motive, no clue. Just three bodies in a blue car abandoned at a boat ramp, its seats damp with salt air. Detectives faced a nightmare. They had almost nothing to go on except a handwritten note with directions found inside the Rogers car. It was scrawled in block letters, simple but distinctive. It said where to turn, where to park, and where to find Oba. For weeks, police chased dead ends through the humid maze of Tampa. They checked every marina, every boat owner, every petty criminal. The handwriting became their obsession. When the police finally released a copy of the note to the press, they hoped someone would recognize it, and someone did. A woman named Judy Blair saw it in the newspaper and felt her stomach drop. Just 2 weeks before the murders, she had met a man who lured her onto a boat for what she thought would be a friendly sunset cruise. Once out on the open water, he raped her. She hadn't reported it, then too scared, too ashamed. But the handwriting in the newspaper was identical to the directions he had written for her. The man's name, she said, was Oba Chandler. The name sent ripples through Tampa's underbelly. Police tracked him to a modest home where Chandler lived with his wife and children. He denied everything, but the evidence began to close in. His fingerprints matched those found on the brochure in the Rogers car. His handwriting was a near-perfect match. DNA from Judy Blair's assault connected him beyond doubt to both crimes. The story that emerged in court was almost unbearable. Prosecutors described how Chandler had gained the Rogers' trust, invited them aboard his boat under the pretense of sightseeing, and then betrayed them with methodical cruelty. He tied their hands, gagged them, and forced them into the dark water one by one to drown. The jury listened in silence as the medical examiner described how each victim struggled inhaling seawater before losing consciousness. Chandler showed no emotion. The trial lasted only a few weeks, but its shadow stretched across decades. Reporters called it one of the most haunting cases in Florida's history, not because of blood or spectacle, but because of the sheer ordinariness of the killer. Chandler wasn't a monster in appearance. He was a man you might ask for help at a gas station or a dock. He smiled, he offered directions, and he turned that trust into a weapon. When the verdict came guilty on all counts, the courtroom exhaled. The judge called the murders cold, calculated, and premeditated. Chandler was sentenced to death. Yet, even as he awaited execution, he refused to confess, offering no apology, no explanation. His silence became his final act of control. On November 15, 2011, more than 2 decades after the killings, Oba Chandler was led to Florida State Prison's death chamber. Witnesses said he lay still as the lethal injection began, his eyes open, his lips pressed into a faint smirk. He spoke no last words. Outside, the families of Joan Michelle and Christy Rogers wept not in celebration but in weary relief. The waters of Tampa Bay glittered that night, calm as glass. Somewhere in their depths lingered the memory of 3 innocent lives and the echo of a mother's final prayer. Evil, it seemed, had come not as a storm, but as a smile. The marina at Tampa Bay in early June was a mosaic of color and noise, the sharp cry of gulls, the chatter of fishermen, the hum of engines rolling out to sea. The sun beat down on the wooden docks, bleaching the ropes and painting everything in a glare of gold and heat. It was 1989, long before the days of cell phones or GPS, when travelers still relied on paper maps, hand-drawn notes, and the kindness of strangers. For Joan Rogers and her 2 daughters, this unfamiliar world was both thrilling and slightly intimidating. They had come from the soft farmlands of Ohio, a place of cornfields and silence, and now they stood by the ocean wide-eyed, smiling, unaware that the man who would soon approach them would be the architect of their deaths. Joan had always been cautious, the kind of mother who double-checked locks and reminded her girls to say thank you to waitresses. She wasn't naive, but she was trusting in that small-town way, believing that decency was universal, that people were mostly good. Her husband Hal had stayed behind to tend to their dairy farm, waving them off with a proud grin as they started their summer road trip. It was meant to be a bonding adventure before Michelle, the eldest, left for college. They drove south for days, stopping at gas stations and cheap motels, writing their adventures in a little blue journal. Saw dolphins today, Michelle had written one morning. Christy got sunburned. Mom laughed. By June 1st, they had reached Tampa, their final stop before heading home. The day was sweltering, the air thick with humidity. After a long drive along the causeway, Joan parked their car near the Days Inn and decided to take the girls down to the marina for one last walk by the water. Boats bobbed gently in their slips. The smell of salt gasoline and fried seafood drifted through the air. It was here, amid the hum of outboard motors and laughter from the nearby bait shop, that they met the stranger. He was standing by a boat ramp, tan and broad-shouldered, his shirt unbuttoned halfway down his chest. His hair was short and sun-bleached, his smile friendly. He looked like someone who belonged to the sea, confident, capable, at ease. When he noticed Joan unfolding her map, squinting at the confusing web of roads around Tampa Bay, he walked over. "Y'all lost?" he asked, his voice easy and warm. Joan looked up, startled, then smiled politely. "Just trying to find our way back to the highway. We're not from around here." He chuckled. "I can tell. You got that tourist-look sunscreen and cameras." He pointed toward the horizon where the bay opened like a mirror under the sinking sun. "You should really see it from the water. Best view in Florida." Michelle giggled and Krista asked about dolphins. The man grinned. "Oh, you'll see plenty of those. I've got a boat right here. You ladies want a little sunset cruise, won't cost you a dime." It was the kind of offer that seemed harmless, spontaneous, generous. A local offering a good time to out-of-towners. Joan hesitated. She was cautious, yes, but there was nothing overtly menacing about the man. He spoke gently, joked easily, and seemed to know everyone who passed by. A few people waved to him as they walked down the dock. He looked safe. Still, Joan said no at first. She thanked him and explained that they needed to get back soon, but he persisted, smiling, saying he could take them out for just an hour, maybe less. "It's beautiful after dark," he said. "All the lights reflecting on the water like stars you can touch." He took out a piece of paper and scribbled some directions explaining how to get to the boat ramp where they could meet later that night. The handwriting was neat, blocky, with an odd slant, a small detail that would later become the key to solving the case. "Just meet me here around 8, he said, tapping the note with his finger. "You'll thank me later." Joan took the note and tucked it into her purse. She smiled, but something in her eyes betrayed uncertainty. Still, the girls were excited, and the promise of one last adventure was too tempting to resist. They said their goodbyes, promising to think about it, and walked back to their car. What they didn't know was that this man, Oba Chandler, had already chosen them. Chandler was at that time 43 years old and living a double life. On the surface, he was a family man, a husband and father, a handyman who worked odd jobs, someone who blended easily into the rhythm of everyday life. Beneath that mask, though, was a history of violence and deceit that stretched back decades. He had been in and out of prison for burglary, theft, and sexual assault. He was a con man by nature, someone who could charm his way into trust and vanish just as easily. He had grown up in poverty in Cincinnati, Ohio. His father had taken his own life when Oba was still a child, an act that left deep fractures in his psyche. As a teenager, he drifted into petty crime, stealing cars, breaking into homes. By his 20s, he was already serving time in prison where he learned how to manipulate people with words and confidence. The sea became his new con. He knew that women, especially tourists, found something romantic about boats, the promise of freedom of adventure, and he knew how to use that. When Chandler looked at Joan and her daughters at the marina, he didn't see people. He saw opportunity. He had used this tactic before, offering a friendly boat ride, gaining trust, and turning that trust into power. He was meticulous, almost ritualistic in his approach. The charm came first, the note second, and the violence last. As night fell, Tampa Bay shimmered under the glow of distant lights. The Rogers women, according to what investigators later pieced together, followed the directions Chandler had written for them. They parked at the ramp, likely nervous but excited. Maybe they hesitated, maybe Joan second-guessed herself. But the girls were eager, and the man waiting for them, calm, polite, smiling, seemed harmless. They stepped onto his boat sometime after dark. Witnesses later reported hearing laughter echoing faintly across the water, then the low hum of an engine heading toward the open bay. After that, nothing but silence. When the sun rose the next morning, Tampa Bay was tranquil again. The water was flat and still, the air heavy with the smell of brine. But beneath that calm, three bodies drifted in the currents, weighted by rope-bound hand and foot, their mouths sealed with duct tape. Fishermen discovered them just after dawn. At first they thought the floating shapes were mannequins, a cruel prank. Then one of them turned the body over and screamed. Within hours, police boats swarmed the area. The scene was surreal. Three women clearly related, their bodies bloated by the water, but still bearing the marks of terror. Each had been thrown alive into the bay, left to struggle until the sea filled their lungs. Detectives from Pinellas County arrived soon after. The local press gathered like vultures, their cameras capturing the image of the blue Oldsmobile parked neatly near the boat ramp, its windows fogged, its seats damp. Inside, officers found the family's belongings, clothes, a half-eaten sandwich, a camera, and a handwritten note with directions. The handwriting would become the thread that unraveled everything. Back at the marina, life went on as if nothing had happened. The same fishermen cleaned their nets, the same seagulls fought over scraps. Oba Chandler returned to his usual routine, smiling at neighbors, fixing things around his home, pretending he hadn't drowned a family the night before. But the sea never truly hides its secrets. Within weeks, the police began to trace the note. They showed copies of it to local businesses, marinas, gas stations, anywhere. Someone might have seen it before. The investigation grew desperate. Detectives knew the killer had been someone local, someone comfortable on the water. But the trail was cold until a newspaper published the note's image. When Judy Blair, a woman from nearby Madeira Beach, opened her morning paper, she froze. The handwriting, those neat, careful block letters, was unmistakable. She had seen it before, written by a man who had offered her a boat ride 2 weeks before the murders. He had seemed kind at first, but once they were alone on the water, he had raped her and left her stranded, traumatized, and silent. She had never gone to the police until now. The man's name, she said, was Oba Chandler. It was the break the detectives had been praying for. At that marina in June, when Joan Rogers first met the stranger with the charming smile, she could not have known the darkness behind it. Chandler had moved through life like a ghost, invisible, ordinary, hiding his true nature beneath layers of charisma. The marina was his hunting ground, the water his weapon. In the photographs taken earlier that day, the Rogers women are radiant, their smiles wide and genuine. They stand together against a backdrop of blue sky and white sand, the ocean stretching endlessly behind them. It is a portrait of innocence and love, frozen in time, taken just hours before they met the stranger who would take everything from them. the tide indifferent as ever rolled on. The Gulf was still when the sun rose on June 2nd, 1989. The air hung heavy with salt and humidity, and the first orange light spread over the Tampa Bay like a wound reopening. To the fishermen setting out before dawn, the water was calm, deceptively so. Pelicans drifted low over the surface. The only sounds were the hum of motors and the splash of nets hitting the shallows. It should have been an ordinary morning, but within hours, the serenity would shatter into horror. Just after 700 a.m., a man named Al Cady, piloting his small boat under the Sunshine Skyway Bridge, spotted something floating in the water, something pale, bobbing oddly in the tide. At first, he thought it was debris, maybe a mannequin from a store display or a large doll washed out to sea. But as he drew closer, the shape became unmistakably human, arms bound, hair fanned out like seaweed. He cut his engine heart hammering and leaned over the edge of the boat. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. A woman's body face down, hands tied tightly behind her back with yellow nylon rope. The wrists were raw and bruised. Around her mouth was a strip of gray duct tape. Her skin had already turned the waxy, unnatural color of the drowned. She drifted gently against the hull, her body rolling with the current as if trying to look up at him. Cady radioed the Coast Guard immediately. By the time the first patrol boat arrived, a second body had been spotted, and then a third. All three were female. All three were bound gagged and had been thrown into the bay alive. When word reached the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office, it sent shockwaves through the department. Triple homicides were rare enough, but this, a mother and her two daughters, was beyond comprehension. Within hours, detectives, divers, and forensic teams swarmed the shoreline. Reporters gathered like vultures, sensing the scale of the story. Detective Glenn Moore, one of the first on scene, would later say that the sight didn't look real. It looked staged, like something out of a nightmare. The bodies were carefully pulled from the water and laid on the deck of a patrol boat. The ropes binding their hands were still tight, the knots precise, methodical. Whoever had done this knew how to handle rope, someone comfortable around boats. The oldest of the three victims, a woman in her 30s, was found wearing a t-shirt and shorts. Around her wrist was a faint line from where a watch had been removed, perhaps before she died. The two younger victims, teenage girls, were dressed similarly. Each bore the same signs of struggle, ligature marks, bruises on their arms, salt in their lungs. The medical examiner later confirmed the unthinkable: they had been alive when they hit the water. On the deck of the recovery boat, the bodies were placed side by side, their faces covered with white sheets. The bay was quiet except for the slap of water against fiberglass. Every man on that boat knew this case was going to break something inside him. Back on shore, detectives began the painstaking process of identifying the victims. There were no purses, no IDs, no immediate clues. But just a few miles away, parked neatly at a nearby boat ramp, they found a blue 1986 Oldsmobile station wagon. The car looked out of place, spotless windows, rolled up keys still in the ignition. Inside were clothes, a camera, a travel guide, and a handwritten note with directions. The note was strange, written in neat block letters, listing turns and landmarks, ending with a simple instruction: boat ramp, turn right at gas station. Investigators didn't know it yet, but this piece of paper would become the thread that would unravel the entire mystery. The car was registered to Hal Rogers, a dairy farmer from Wilshire, Ohio. When local authorities contacted him that evening, he answered the phone, expecting a routine update from his wife. Instead, he was told that 3 bodies had been found in Florida, believed to be his wife Joan and their daughters Michelle and Christ. The silence on the other end of the line was described later as unearthly. Hal had to sit down. He said nothing for a long time before whispering, "Are you sure?" The investigator said softly, "We're not certain yet, sir, but everything points to them." Back in Florida, the medical examiner confirmed the identifications within 24 hours. Joan Rogers, 36. Michelle Rogers, 17. Christy Rogers, 14. All from Ohio, all drowned in the Gulf of Mexico. The story hit national headlines. By the next morning, mother and 2 daughters found bound in Tampa Bay. The public reaction was instantaneous. Tampa, a city that prided itself on sunshine beaches and tourism, suddenly felt haunted. Locals grew wary of strangers, of the water itself. The marinas emptied for days, boat rentals, canceled, fishermen muttering that the bay had turned cursed. Detective Sergeant Kevin Bennett led the task force that formed within 48 hours. They called it Operation Sea Hunt. The goal, find the man who took a family out for a boat ride and never brought them back. The investigation began with the only tangible clue, the note found in the Rogers car. Handwriting analysts were brought in. It was clean, careful, and written by someone trying to appear neat, but there was something off about the spacing of forced symmetry. Police believed it had been written by a man who wanted to disguise his natural script. They photocopied it and distributed it to every marina, bait shop, and boat rental business in the Tampa area. Leads poured in, but most were dead ends. Witnesses reported seeing a friendly man with a boat near the Days Inn on Memorial Highway talking to tourists. But no one knew his name. He had simply vanished into the swarm of dockside faces. Meanwhile, back in Wilshire, Ohio, grief settled like winter. The Rogers home, once full of noise and laughter, fell silent. Neighbors brought food, sat quietly on the porch, unsure of what to say. Hal, in shock, spoke little. He refused to look at the television where reporters dissected every detail of the case. He kept his wife's last note, a postcard mailed from Tampa, in his shirt pocket. It said only, "See you soon, love you." The funeral drew hundreds. 3 caskets, white and small, beneath a gray sky. The local pastor spoke of faith and forgiveness, but his voice trembled. People whispered in the pews about how something like this could happen, how anyone could harm such a kind family. In Florida, fear began to mingle with frustration. Weeks passed, and still the killer remained a phantom. Police divers combed the bay for additional evidence, ropes, tape weights, anything, but the water gave up few secrets. The Gulf, with its endless movement, had already washed away most of the clues. Detectives returned again and again to the handwritten note. Something about it gnawed at them. It was too detailed to be random, too deliberate. This guy wasn't impulsive, one investigator said later. He planned this. He wanted control from start to finish. The handwriting sample was compared against hundreds of locals, boat owners, workers, ex-cons, but no match was found. Then in July, the department decided on a gamble release, the note to the public. A photocopy appeared in the St. Petersburg Times and on local TV. The image was simple, a few lines of text directions scribbled on cheap white paper. Beneath it, a plea, "Do you recognize this handwriting? Call Crime Stoppers." 2 days later, a phone rang at the police station. The woman on the line said quietly, "I know who wrote that note." Her name was Judy Blair, and her story made the detectives' blood run cold. She told them that 2 weeks before the murder, she had been at a marina in Madeira Beach when she met a man who offered her a boat ride. He was polite, she said. Charming, really. Said he knew all the best spots to see the sunset. She hesitated to go at first, but eventually agreed. Once they were out on the water, miles from shore, his demeanor changed. He became controlling, aggressive. He tied her hands under the pretense of showing her boating knots, then raped her. When she begged him to take her back, he laughed. But eventually, he did, dumping her near the dock and speeding away. She never went to the police, terrified and ashamed. But when she saw that handwriting in the paper, she knew instantly. "It's him," she said. "It's the same man. He wrote me directions just like that." His name, she told them, was Oba Chandler. Detectives ran the name through their system, and there he was. A long criminal record, burglary, theft, assault, fraud. A man with a pattern of charm followed by violence. He lived just minutes from the marina where the Rogers women had met the stranger. Suddenly, the horror began to take shape. Witnesses at the Days Inn confirmed seeing a man matching Chandler's description talking to 3 women from Ohio around June 1st. Handwriting experts compared his samples to the note a match. When police obtained a warrant for his fingerprints, they found another match on the brochure inside the Rogers car. The web tightened. But for the detectives, knowing and proving were 2 different things. They needed DNA, they needed confession, and most of all, they needed to understand what had truly happened that night on the water, how a seemingly ordinary man had turned the Gulf of Mexico into a graveyard. By the end of that summer, Tampa no longer felt like a city of sunshine. It felt haunted. Locals whispered about the man with the boat, and tourists looked over their shoulders when strangers smiled too warmly. Mothers warned their daughters not to go near the docks after dark. The bay itself seemed different, the way the light hit it at dusk, the way the water carried an unseen weight. But beneath the surface of all that fear, the detectives of Operation Sea Hunt were beginning to close in. The handwriting, the fingerprints, the DNA, it was all leading in one direction. And though Oba Chandler still walked free, still smiled at his neighbors, still pretended to be ordinary, the walls were closing fast. The gulf, which had hidden his crime for months, was about to turn against him. By late summer of 1989, Tampa had grown uneasy under its endless sun. The beaches still shimmered and the water still sparkled blue, but beneath that postcard beauty there was a quiet current of fear. The story of the three women from Ohio, the mother and her daughters, had taken root in every conversation, every whispered warning. At night, locals said you could still feel something heavy in the air near the bay, as if the water itself remembered. Inside the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office, the case files stacked higher each week. Detective Sergeant Kevin Bennett and his task force had become obsessed with one name, Oba Chandler, the man Judy Blair had identified as the author of the note that led Joan Rogers and her daughters to their deaths. The detectives could feel it, this was their man. But proving it would take precision. The handwriting was the first solid thread. Experts from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement compared Chandler's samples with the directions found in the Rogers Oldsmobile. The loops, the spacing, the deliberate block letters all matched. The analyst's report was concise. Probability of same writer extremely high. It wasn't yet enough for an arrest, but it gave the task force momentum. Next came the fingerprints. During the sweep of the Rogers vehicle, technicians had lifted a faint latent print from a tourist brochure tucked in the glove compartment. It was partial blurred by moisture, but still readable. When cross-referenced through AFS, it pinged with a match Oba Chandler. That was the moment when theory hardened into certainty. Still, Bennett wanted more. Chandler was cautious, clever. He'd eluded law enforcement for years through lies, aliases, and smooth talking. We knew he'd never confess, Bennett later recalled. He was too proud, too confident in his own manipulation. They needed physical evidence to tie him beyond any doubt, and DNA would be their anchor. The victim who had survived Judy Blair became the key witness the case desperately needed. When detectives met with her, again, she was nervous but resolute. She told them every detail, his smile, his words, the way he had tied her wrists under the pretense of a demonstration. Then came the most crucial part, the rape kit that had been preserved after she finally reported the assault. Forensic testing of the sample revealed semen, and when it was compared against DNA found on evidence from the Rogers case, it matched. It was a rare scientific triumph in 1989 when DNA analysis was still new. But the results were clear. The same man who had assaulted Judy Blair had been on the boat with the Rogers women. Detectives stared at the lab report in stunned silence. After months of dead ends, they finally had what they needed. Now came the delicate part, watching Chandler without spooking him. Detectives set up quiet surveillance around his home in Tampa's East Lake area. From the outside, it was a typical Florida neighborhood, palm trees, swaying sprinklers, ticking children playing in yards. Chandler lived with his wife and several of his children. Neighbors described him as polite, helpful, the kind of guy who'd lend you a wrench. To the task force, he was a serpent under that suburban calm. Detectives followed him everywhere, to the gas station, the bait shop, the marina. He always seemed comfortable near the water, often spending hours alone by the docks, cleaning his boat, polishing the metal until it gleamed. One detective later said he treated that boat like a church. It was where he prayed and where he killed. They recorded his movements, noting every person he spoke to. He flirted easily, especially with women who looked lost or lonely. Sometimes he'd offer directions, sometimes just conversation. The pattern was eerily familiar. It was exactly how Joan Rogers and her daughters had been approached. In September 1992, more than 3 years after the murders, detectives decided it was time to confront him. Chandler was summoned under the pretense of a routine questioning about boating regulations. When he walked into the interview room dressed neatly in a collared shirt and jeans, he smiled as if meeting old friends. Detective Bennett began casually asking about his boat, his business, his family. Chandler answered easily with a salesman's rhythm. But when the conversation turned toward the Rogers family, his composure wavered. "I read about that," he said, shaking his head. "Terrible thing, but I don't know anything about it." Bennett slid the photocopy of the handwritten note across the table. "You ever seen this before?" Chandler studied it for a moment, then shrugged. Looks like directions. Could be anybody's writing. It's yours, Bennett said softly. Chandler smiled faintly, leaning back in his chair. You're mistaken. Then Bennett placed the brochure from the Rogers car on the table, the one bearing Chandler's fingerprint. The smile faltered. And when Bennett mentioned the DNA match to Judy Blair's assault, the mask cracked entirely. Chandler's jaw tightened. He shifted in his seat. But still he denied everything. I never met those women, he said. You're trying to frame me because I've been in trouble before. The detectives knew they wouldn't get a confession, but they didn't need one anymore. That afternoon, September 24th, 1992, Oba Chandler was formally arrested for the murders of Joan Michelle and Christy Rogers. Officers surrounded his house just after noon. He opened the door calmly, hands raised. You boys sure about this? He asked. They were. Inside the home, investigators found a trove of small but damning item, a roll of gray duct tape, identical to that used on the victim's yellow nylon rope, matching the ligatures, and a series of maps marked with routes around Tampa Bay. His boat, when seized, revealed faint traces of adhesive on the railing and fibers consistent with the victim's clothing. Neighbors were stunned. He was so normal, one woman told reporters. He'd wave to you. He'd help fix your engine. You'd never think. Her voice trailed off. When news broke of the arrest, Tampa exhaled for the first time in 3 years. Headlines across the country screamed the Tampa Bay. Even with Chandler behind bars, the prosecution moved carefully. The case had to be airtight. Detectives re-interviewed every witness, traced every piece of rope, every supply purchase, every dock he had used. They mapped his movements on the night of June 1st, 1989, his boat's likely path across the bay, the currents that carried the bodies, the time frame that matched the tide charts. The timeline fit perfectly. The Rogers women had left their motel just before dusk. Witnesses placed Chandler's boat near the same marina an hour later. By 10:00 p.m., no one had seen them again. Investigators reconstructed the sequence of events with chilling precision. Chandler lured them aboard under the guise of a sunset cruise. Once they were far enough from shore, he restrained them, likely one at a time, using rope and duct tape. He then forced them into the water, alive perhaps, to erase evidence, or because killing them outright would have drawn too much attention. Every step bore his signature control manipulation silence. During the months leading to trial, another crucial piece surfaced at a jailhouse confession. A cellmate of Chandler's came forward claiming that Chandler had spoken freely about the murders. According to the witness, Chandler bragged about being smarter than the police and said, "They can't prove I drowned them, the water did." He also revealed details never released to the public, the type of rope, the order of the victims, and the precise location where the boat had drifted. When detectives verified these details, every one of them matched. The statement solidified what prosecutors already knew: Chandler's arrogance was his undoing. As journalists dug into his past, a clearer picture of Oba Chandler emerged. Not a sudden monster, but a lifetime in the making. His early life was marked by instability and violence. His father's suicide when he was 10 had fractured something deep within him. By 14, he was stealing cars. By 17, he was in juvenile detention. Friends described him as two people in one body, charming one moment, explosive the next. Women were drawn to him, at least until they saw the volatility beneath his charm. He married multiple times, fathered several children, and drifted between jobs. Beneath it all, there was a deep resentment of authority, of women, of anyone who made him feel small. The boating trips became his theater of control. Out on the water, he was king. No rules, no witnesses, no escape. By the spring of 1994, nearly 5 years after the murders, Chandler's trial date was set. The evidence was overwhelming: DNA, fingerprints, handwriting, rope fibers, and eyewitness testimony. Yet he remained calm, even smug in interviews. They got the wrong man, he told reporters. I've done bad things, but not that. For the families of Joan Michelle and Cruz, the wait for justice had been unbearable. Hal Rogers, stoic and broken, attended every hearing, sitting silently in the front row. I just want to know why he said once. Chandler never answered. Detective Bennett would later reflect, he wasn't driven by passion or rage. He killed because he could, because in that moment he held absolute control. It was about power, not hate. As the trial loomed, prosecutors rehearsed their closing image for the jury: the serene waters of Tampa Bay. A paradise that had become a tomb. They would show the handwritten note, the rope, the fingerprints, and the face of the man who smiled as he led a mother and her daughters to their deaths. Chandler, meanwhile, spent his days in a windowless cell, writing letters, planning his defense, maintaining his innocence. But in quiet moments when the lights went out, he must have heard the water, again that gentle slap of the tide against the hull, the same sound that had accompanied his crime. The net that had taken years to weave had finally closed around him. There would be no escape this time, no smooth talking his way out. The tide had turned, and it carried with it the weight of justice. By the spring of 1994, 5 long years had passed since the bodies of Joan Michelle and Christy Rogers had been pulled from the waters of Tampa Bay. The horror had faded from headlines, but not from memory. In Florida's courthouses, everyone knew the name Oba Chandler, the smiling boatman who had turned a mother's trust into her death sentence. And now, at last, he was going to stand trial. The courthouse in Clearwater was modern, bright, and clean, but during the Chandler trial, it felt heavy, as though grief itself had settled in the hallways. Journalists from across the country filled the press rows. Sketch artists sharpened pencils, reporters whispered into tape recorders. Outside, the morning sun glared off the marble steps, and curious locals gathered behind police tape just to glimpse the man whose name had haunted their city. When the deputies brought Chandler into the courtroom for the first time, the hush was immediate. He looked smaller than people expected, pale tidy, wearing a light blue shirt and slacks. His eyes flicked across the room, assessing everything. Then he smiled faintly, as if amused by the attention. At the front sat Hal Rogers, the widower from Ohio, his face hard and expressionless. He had traveled hundreds of miles to sit in that courtroom, the last place he wanted to be, because he had promised his wife and daughters he would see it through. He never looked at Chandler, not once. The lead prosecutor, Doug Crow, opened with quiet force. The evidence, he told the jury, will show that this defendant offered 3 innocent women a ride. They trusted him. And for that trust, he bound their hands, silenced their voices, and threw them alive into the waters of Tampa Bay. His words hung in the air like smoke. Crow's team laid out the case with surgical precision. The handwritten note was projected on a screen for the jury to see, the same note found in the Rogers car, written in Chandler's distinct blocky script. Then came the fingerprint analysis, the rope fibers, the duct tape. The jurors leaned forward, their faces tense. But the most devastating moment came when Judy Blair took the stand. The courtroom fell silent as she walked to the witness chair, her voice trembling but clear. She told the story of how Chandler had offered her a boat ride just 2 weeks before the Rogers murders, how he'd charmed her, how his demeanor had shifted the moment they were alone on the water, how he'd tied her wrists and raped her. She recounted the note he'd written for her, nearly identical to the one found in the Rogers car. And then she pointed to the man sitting across from her. "That's him," she said, her voice cracking. "That's the man." Chandler didn't flinch. He just stared back expressionless. The prosecutor paused to let her words sink in. The same handwriting, he said softly, the same method, the same man. Chandler's defense attorney, Robert Love, faced an impossible task. The evidence was overwhelming, the public hatred palpable. His only option was to create doubt, any doubt. He argued that there was no direct eyewitness to the murders, no confession, and that the DNA evidence, while compelling, was circumstantial since it came from another crime. He painted Chandler as a victim of overzealous detectives and media hysteria. "The state wants a monster love," told the jury, and they found a convenient one. But Chandler's own demeanor undercut the defense. He was too calm, too detached. He smirked when evidence was shown. When photographs of the victims were displayed, the last pictures ever taken of Joan and her daughters smiling in the Florida sun, Chandler leaned back and crossed his arms. To the jurors, that composure didn't read as innocence, it read as ice. Forensic experts took the stand next. The rope that bound the victims was traced to a specific brand sold at local marinas. Records showed that Chandler had purchased rope and duct tape of that type just days before the murders. A crime scene analyst described the precision of the knots. A classic boater's slip knot tied by someone experienced with marine rigging. This wasn't improvised, he testified. These were deliberate, practiced knots. Then came the testimony that sealed Chandler's fate, the DNA evidence. In calm, methodical detail, a forensic biologist, explained how the genetic material from Judy Blair's assault matched the profile found on items connected to the Rogers case. At the time, DNA analysis was still new. Juries were learning to trust the science, but the clarity of the match left little room for doubt. Finally, a handwriting expert demonstrated the similarities between the directions written for Judy Blair and the note found in the Rogers car. The strokes, the pressure, the awkward spacing identical. Every piece, every line of testimony fit together like the tightening knots that had taken the Rogers women's lives. On the fourth day of the trial, Hal Rogers took the stand. The courtroom was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. He spoke softly, describing his wife Joan, her laugh, her kindness, her devotion to their daughters. He told the jury about Michelle's dream of becoming a veterinarian, about Krista's love of photography. When the prosecutor asked if he had anything to say to the jury, Hal paused. "I sent them on that trip because I thought it would make them happy," he said. His voice cracked, and for a moment the courtroom was utterly still. "I never thought I'd be bringing them home in coffins." Even the jurors looked down. Chandler sat motionless, his hands folded on the table. By the second week, the defense had little left to offer. They tried to cast suspicion on other local boat owners, suggesting that the waters around Tampa Bay were full of drifters and criminals. They hinted that Chandler was being framed because of his past. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the jury wasn't buying it. In the closing arguments, prosecutor Doug Crow stood before the 12 jurors and held up the note. "This," he said, "is not just handwriting. It's a death warrant written by this man." He pointed to Chandler, who stared back blankly. He gave them directions not to safety, but to their graves. When the jury retired to deliberate, the room exhaled for the first time in days. They were gone for only 77 minutes. When they returned, the foreman stood and read the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Oba Chandler, guilty of the murders of Joan Rogers, Michelle Rogers, and Christy Rogers." There was no outburst, no applause, only a ripple of quiet relief that swept through the courtroom like wind. Chandler blinked, his face empty. He showed no reaction as deputies led him away. The penalty phase came next. The prosecution argued for death. This was not a crime of passion, Crow said. This was control, cruelty, and deliberate murder. He described how the victims had been alive when they hit the water, the panic, the helplessness, the slow horror of drowning. "He watched them die," Crow said, his voice sharp with fury. "He made them die." The defense asked for mercy, citing Chandler's troubled childhood, his father's suicide, his years of poverty. But the jury had seen enough. On November 4th, 1994, the judge delivered the sentence, death by lethal injection. He called the murders cold, calculated, and premeditated, committed with utter disregard for human life. When asked if he wished to make a statement, Chandler shook his head. "No, sir," he said quietly. Hal Rogers sat in the front row, eyes fixed forward. For him, there was no satisfaction in the verdict, only a hollow ache. Justice, yes. Closure, never. The verdict sent waves through Florida. Newspapers called Chandler the smiling killer, the man without remorse, the predator of the Bay. Reporters revisited every detail of the investigation, turning the story into a grim, cautionary tale. In Ohio, the Rogers hometown gathered for a memorial service, planting 3 trees by the local school in memory of Joan, Michelle, and Christe. The pastor said they had traveled south for sunshine and met a man whose heart was darker than the deepest ocean. For the detectives who had spent years chasing the case, the conviction was a bittersweet victory. They had caught the monster, but the images of the bodies in the bay, the rope burns, the drowned eyes would never leave them. And for Chandler, the walls of his cell became the last shoreline he would ever know. In the years that followed, as Chandler sat on death row, he filed appeals, all denied. Reporters occasionally interviewed him, hoping for confession, remorse, something human. They got nothing. He always maintained his innocence, even as the evidence stood unshakable. He spent 17 years in a 6 by 9 foot cell at Florida State Prison. His only consistent activity was writing letters, notes, small observations, all in that same neat, blocky handwriting. When his execution date was finally set for November 15, 2011, he was 65 years old. That morning, he ate his last meal, pork chops, fried potatoes, and a salad. He refused a final statement. Witnesses said he looked calm, almost detached. At 4:08 p.m., the warden gave the signal. As the lethal chemicals flowed through his veins, Chandler's breathing slowed, his eyes fluttered. then finally closed. Timing of death, 4:25 p.m. Outside, as the sun sank over Tampa Bay, Hal Rogers stood among the small crowd of reporters. When asked what he felt, he said softly, "It's over," but nothing brings them back. Then he walked away without another word. In the years since, the case of Oba Chandler has become a grim chapter in Florida's history, a story of trust betrayed and justice finally delivered. It changed the way police departments shared information, how marinas logged visitors, and how families viewed the dangers of friendly strangers. But perhaps its most lasting echo is not in the law, but in the silence of Tampa Bay itself. At sunset, when the water glows gold and red, some say it's beautiful. Others say it feels haunted, as if the sea still remembers the night it took three innocent souls and the man who thought it never would tell. When the needle emptied into Oba Chandler's veins on November 15, 2011, the room inside Florida State Prison was silent, not with pity, but with the weight of history closing a long, terrible circle. For 22 years, his name had been synonymous with fear. Now the man who had stolen three innocent lives beneath the moonlit waters of Tampa Bay was finally gone. Yet even as the curtain fell on Chandler's life, the shadow he left behind refused to disappear. Justice, after all, is not a single moment. It lingers in memory, in law, in the uneasy question of how something so monstrous could hide behind such an ordinary smile. For those who had lived through it, detectives, reporters, and especially the Rogers family, the case was never truly over. Years after the execution, Detective Glenn Moore still kept a copy of the original handwritten note pinned to his bulletin board. He said he couldn't bring himself to throw it away. It's a reminder, he explained quietly, that evil doesn't always look like evil. Sometimes it looks helpful. Other investigators from Operation Sea Hunt described how the case had changed them. Before Chandler, many officers still believed in clear moral lines, good men, bad men, obvious monsters. Chandler blurred all of that. He was polite, soft-spoken, and capable of violence so calculated it seemed inhuman. He wasn't driven by rage, one detective said. He was driven by control. He wanted to feel powerful. That's worse in a way because it's so cold. In the small Ohio town of Wilshire, where the Rogers family had lived, time moved differently. The farmhouse was still there, weathered quiet, standing against endless fields of corn. Hal Rogers kept to himself. After the trial, he rarely spoke to reporters, but when he did, his words carried the simple grief of a man who had outlived everything he loved. "You don't heal from something like that," he said once. "You just learn to carry it without letting it crush you." Each year, on the anniversary of the murders, Hal drove to the local cemetery and placed 3 white lilies at the headstones marked Joan, Michelle, and Christ. No one followed him. He never stayed long. For Tampa, the Rogers murders became a defining scar. The bay that had once symbolized freedom, sunlit, easy open, became for years a place of quiet dread. Boat tours dwindled. Women avoided late-night marinas. Parents told their daughters not to talk to friendly strangers offering just a little ride. The Florida Tourism Board even ran public safety campaigns in the early 1990s, reminding travelers to verify credentials, to report suspicious activity, to trust your instincts. Behind those polite slogans was the ghost of Chandler's grin. But something else grew from the fear resolve. Law enforcement agencies across the state began sharing data more efficiently. DNA analysis, still in its infancy during the Rogers case, became a central pillar of criminal investigations. The FBI later credited the Chandler investigation with accelerating the adoption of nationwide DNA databases. "You could say those women changed how we solve crimes," one forensic expert reflected. "It's tragic, but their deaths forced progress. It made sure fewer monsters could hide behind charm and water." When Chandler's execution date was announced, debate flared across Florida. The death penalty, as always, drew fierce arguments: justice versus vengeance, closure versus cruelty. Reporters asked Hal Rogers how he felt about the state taking Chandler's life. He paused for a long moment before answering. "I don't want revenge," he said, "but I want peace. And peace means knowing he'll never hurt anyone again." His words carried the quiet authority of someone who had lived with grief for more than 2 decades. For him, the execution wasn't triumph. It was maintenance, the closing of a wound that could no longer be allowed to bleed. That night, outside the prison gates, a small group of people gathered. Some held candles, some held signs protesting the death penalty. A few were there for the Rogers family, standing silently in the cool November air. When the announcement came over the prison speakers, Oba Chandler pronounced dead at 4:25 p.m., there was no applause, only stillness. Inside, the witnesses said he looked the same at the end as he had in the beginning, calm, detached, unrepentant. He offered no apology, no last words. The man who had manipulated, lied, and smiled his way through life died without a sound. In the years after Chandler's execution, his story became required reading in Florida's criminal justice courses, not for its sensationalism, but for its lessons. The case demonstrated how multiple agencies could fail to connect dots early on, and how new forensic tools could bridge those gaps. It also exposed the fragile nature of trust between strangers. The term Chandler pattern even entered some criminology textbooks describing predators who lure victims through apparent helpfulness and control them through isolation and fear. True crime documentaries, podcasts, and books retold the case with varying tones, some sensational, others somber. Yet the most haunting retelling came from the people who were actually there. Retired officers speaking years later said what still disturbed them wasn't the violence itself, but the serenity of the killer. He didn't panic, one said. He didn't rage. He just did it, step by step, like tying a knot. For many Floridians, the Rogers case also forced a broader reflection on tourism, vulnerability, and gender. It became part of the conversation about how women move through the world, how they are taught to be polite, to trust, to accept help, even when instinct whispers no. Joan Rogers had done what countless travelers would have done, accepted kindness in an unfamiliar place. And for that, she and her daughters paid the ultimate price. Even now, decades later, locals swear the bay carries its own kind of memory. Fishermen who cast nets near the Sunshine Skyway Bridge say the water there feels heavy, as if the current itself slows. At sunset, when the sky turns blood orange and the water mirrors it back, people talk quietly about that night in 1989. The Gulf doesn't speak, but it remembers. There's a small memorial plaque near the bridge, now 3 names etched in bronze, placed there by community members who refuse to let the story sink into silence. Tourists pass it without noticing, but locals stop, sometimes leaving flowers or folded notes. On the anniversary of the murders, someone always leaves 3 white ribbons tied to the railing. No one knows who. Years after the case, Detective Kevin Bennett, who had spent countless nights poring over maps, rope samples, and tide charts, retired from the force. In interviews, he rarely mentioned Chandler by name. He doesn't deserve to be remembered for who he was, Bennett said, only for what he did and for who he took. He spoke instead about the Rogers family, about the quiet bravery of Hal, and about the importance of listening to intuition. Evil doesn't walk around wearing a warning sign, he said. It holds a door open for you. It smiles, it offers you directions. He kept one photograph from the case, not of Chandler, but of Joan Michelle and Christy, taken days before the murders. They're standing on a beach, squinting into the sunlight, arms around each other. That's the image that matters, he said. Not the man who killed them, the people who lived before him. The Rogers murders changed how women traveled. Safety pamphlets began including warnings about unverified boat tours. Rental companies introduced stricter ID checks. Police departments across the U.S. started tracking transient criminals who moved between states. Even the tourism brochures changed, showing not just beaches and dolphins, but hotlines for traveler safety. Out of tragedy, there was evolution. Out of fear, there was vigilance. But for those closest to the case, justice remained something quieter, not the bang of a gavel, but the fading echo of suffering. Justice doesn't feel like victory, said one prosecutor years later. It feels like stillness, like the world has finally stopped spinning for a second. In the end, the story of Oba Chandler isn't just about a killer. It's about how fragile trust can be and how courage, even in grief, can rebuild what evil tries to destroy. Hal Rogers never remarried. He never moved away from the farm. Friends said he lived simply, quietly, as if carrying his family's memory required all his strength. Before he died in 2017, he told a local reporter, "I still see them every day, in the sun, in the fields, in the quiet. I forgave him because I had to, but I'll never forget." The Gulf of Mexico still rolls against the Florida shore, indifferent as ever. The marina where Joan met the smiling stranger has long since changed hands, its docks rebuilt, its wood replaced. Tourists still come and go, chasing sunsets, laughter, and the illusion of safety. Most never know what happened there, how three trusting hearts were pulled beneath those same waters. But the bay remembers. And somewhere in that shimmering expanse of gold and salt and silence lies the real legacy of the Rogers case. Not just in the justice delivered, but in the reminder it carved into Florida's soul. That evil can wear a friendly face, that trust is sacred and dangerous, and that even the calmest waters can hide the darkest depths. The story of Oba Chandler ends where it began on the water. The same blue expanse that had once shimmered with promise became a mirror of human cruelty, reflecting back not only what one man did, but what it revealed about trust, fear, and justice. In the years since his execution, the tide has rolled on, indifferent. Boats still glide across Tampa Bay gulls, still circle the causeway, and sunsets still burn gold against the horizon. But beneath that beauty lies the memory of three lives stolen in the quietest of ways. Not through rage or chance, but through the deliberate betrayal of kindness. Joan Rogers and her daughters never screamed into a crowd or fought for survival on land. They disappeared into the silence of the Gulf, where only the moon bore witness. It is easy, when speaking of monsters, to imagine shadows and snarls, but the horror of Oba Chandler is precisely that there was none. He was polite, ordinary. He looked like help when help was all they needed. That truth unsettles because it dismantles our illusion of safety. Evil, it turns out, doesn't always come crashing through the door. Sometimes it smiles, offers directions, and waits for the dark. Yet, for all its darkness, this story is also one of endurance. It is about detectives who refuse to give up when the trail turned cold. About a survivor, Judy Blair, who found the courage to speak when silence would have been easier. About a father, Hal Rogers, who faced the unimaginable and still chose to stand in a courtroom so justice could have a face. These were the people who pulled light from the water. When Oba Chandler died, the state marked the moment with a sterile line on an official document executed 4:25 p.m. November 15, 2011. But his victims are remembered differently, not by the time of their deaths, but by the warmth of their lives. Joan's steady kindness, Michelle's quiet ambition, Christe's laughter that once filled the Ohio farmhouse. Those memories are what remain unsinkable. The Gulf of Mexico forgets nothing. Each ripple that touches the shore carries fragments of what was lost. The innocence of a family's adventure, the fragile faith between strangers, and the promise that justice, however delayed, can still rise like the tide. As the sun sinks over Tampa Bay, the water turns to gold, then blood, then darkness. Somewhere in that vast and silent expanse lies the echo of three hearts that once beat together, a mother and her daughters forever bound by love and by the sea that took them. Their story is a warning, yes, but also a testament that even in the face of unspeakable cruelty, truth endures, justice endures, memory endures, and the tide, relentless and eternal, remembers.